You actually believed that money was going to be yours? After everything I built and everything your stepmother and I planned, you think you're entitled to walk away with a piece of it. The medical records I had altered don't lie. They show exactly why you're not the one who can handle that kind of responsibility. The future I talked about when you were younger, it was never real. It was a string I pulled to keep you compliant. If you try to fight this, remember who taught you how to investigate. You'll only find what I allow you to find. Hi, my name is Olivia Parker. I am 34 years old. Those 5 lines from my father landed like precision strikes. I had walked into his study that afternoon in our high-end gated neighborhood, expecting a conversation. What I got was the confirmation that every promise he had ever made me was a calculated tool. The inheritance from the sale of his private investigation firm, the future he had dangled for years, the security I had quietly counted on it, had all been fiction designed to keep me from asking the wrong questions. If you were sitting across from your own father while he told you the one thing you had built your sense of stability around was never real, would you choose yourself? I left his house with my hands steady on the wheel, my mind already cataloging evidence the way he had taught me. The difference was that this time, the target was him. For months, I had felt the ground shifting. My stepmother, Linda, had grown colder, more possessive of every financial discussion. My brother Ethan had started receiving quiet phone calls and private meetings I was no longer invited to. I had told myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid. Then the medical records mentioned slipped out of my father's mouth like it was nothing, and the mask slipped completely. The next morning, I called Ryan Sullivan. He was a private investigator I had worked with on 2 previous legal cases. I trusted him because he never asked unnecessary questions, and he delivered clean documentation. Ryan, I need everything on my father's recent asset movements and any communication between him and Linda, I said, quietly. He didn't hesitate. Send me what you have. I'll start today. While Ryan worked, I started my own notebook. Same black leather, same spiral, binding my father had used for decades. The irony was not lost on me. The man who had drilled pattern recognition and microbehavior into me was now the subject. I wrote the date, and the first observation subject used altered medical records as justification for exclusion. Timeline suggests planning began at least 6 months prior. I added a second column for counter evidence the way he had taught me, forcing myself to stay clinical, even when my chest felt tight. 3 days later, Ryan called me back to his office. He slid a thin folder across the desk, found the first batch of emails, he said. They were in an old account he thought he wiped. He didn't. I opened the folder. The first email was from my father to Linda, dated 6 months earlier. The girl is circling again. We move the bulk through the new structure before she asks for documentation. The medical angle is clean. No one questions altered records when they come from the right source. My hands stayed still on the page, but something inside me went very quiet. He had not only planned to cut me out, he had manufactured evidence to make it look justified. The same man who had once told me never to fabricate, never to cross that line, had crossed it for my stepmother and against me. I kept reading. The emails grew more specific. They mentioned ensuring the money stays where it belongs and references to the true heir. At the time, I assumed they meant Ethan. I was wrong, but I did not know that yet. Ryan watched me. There's more. They've been meeting with a financial advisor named Victor Lang 3 times in the last month. Same pattern every time, mid-afternoon always, when Ethan is traveling for work. Same building. Same duration. The parallel to the old stories my father used to tell about surveillance was almost funny. Almost. I hired Ryan for another 2 weeks and asked Laura Bennett, a lawyer I trusted from a previous case, to review anything we found for legal exposure. Laura was sharp and had no patience for family theater. Olivia, if those medical records are fabricated and they use them to influence a will or trust, that's fraud, she said over coffee. But you need proof of intent and execution. Emails are good. Altered records are better. Keep going. I kept going. I started my own light surveillance on the meetings with Victor Lang. I parked 2 blocks away, used the same tradecraft my father had drilled into me since I was 16. The first time I saw them together, my father, Linda, and Victor Lang walking out of the building laughing, I felt the last thread of denial snap. They were relaxed, comfortable. This was not new stress. This was routine. Then the emails leaked. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was at home when Ethan called, his voice tight. "Olivia, I just got forwarded something. It's emails between Dad and Linda. They're talking about you like you're a problem to be solved. And there's a name, Daniel Harper. Do you know who that is?" The floor seemed to tilt. The emails had surfaced without me pushing them. Someone inside their circle had forwarded them to my brother. The crisis was no longer private. I met Ethan that evening at a quiet diner. He looked shaken in a way I had never seen. He slid his phone across the table. The forwarded chain was longer than the ones Ryan had found. It included planning for reallocating the remaining assets once the medical documentation was finalized. And the name Daniel Harper appeared again in a line from Linda. "Once Daniel is positioned, the rest of the estate flows cleanly. Olivia won't have standing to contest once the records are public." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. The promised future had never existed. The medical records were fabricated, and now there was a name none of us recognized, positioned as the real recipient. Ethan looked at me. "What are you going to do?" I closed the phone and handed it back. The same thing Dad taught me to do when someone lies for a living. "I'm going to finish the case." He nodded once, then said the thing that made the next step inevitable. "I'm not going to stand in your way, but I'm also not going to help you burn it all down. I still have to live with him." I understood. He chose silence to protect his own peace. I chose something else. That night, I wrote in the notebook until my hand cramped. I listed every email, every altered record, every meeting with Victor Lang. I added a new section, questions for confrontation. I did not know yet that the confrontation would end with a true heir walking through the door and every remaining family gathering dying with it. I only knew that the man who had raised me to see through lies had finally run out of places to hide his own. The notebook sat open on my kitchen table the next morning. Every line a quiet accusation written in my own hand. I had spent the night turning my father's own methods against him, and the weight of it settled heavier than I expected. Ryan called before I finished my coffee. I pulled the full email chain. There's a second account we missed. They've been moving pieces for almost a year, and the medical records. They weren't just altered ones. There are 3 versions, each one more damning than the last. Your father signed off on the changes himself. I drove to his office with the notebook in my bag. Ryan had printed everything. The newest batch showed my stepmother Linda pushing harder than I realized. "Richard, if we don't lock this down before she gets a lawyer involved, we lose control. The medical documentation has to be airtight. Once it's in the file, no judge will give her standing." My father's reply was shorter. "She won't get that far." I raised her to know when she's beaten. I read it twice. The sarcasm in his words was the same tone he had used in the study. He had taught me to spot that tone in other people. He never expected me to hear it aimed at myself. Laura Bennett met me later that afternoon at her office downtown. She read the emails without changing expression until she reached the part about the medical records. "This is fraud," she said flatly. "If these records were created to influence an estate or trust, and they were knowingly false, that's a criminal matter. But you need to decide how far you want to take it. Civil suit, criminal complaint, or both. Either way, once you file, the family is done." I nodded. "I'm not looking for the money anymore. I'm looking for the truth on record. He doesn't get to rewrite my life and walk away clean." Laura studied me for a moment. "Then we build the case the right way?" No shortcuts. And Olivia, expect them to come at you hard when they realize you're not backing down. People who fabricate medical records don't usually stop at paperwork. She was right. 2 days later, my father showed up at my door without calling. He stood on the porch like he still owned the ground I stood on. "You've been busy," he said. No greeting. Just that same cold edge. "Ryan Sullivan. Laura Bennett. You think I wouldn't notice I kept my voice even? You taught me to follow the evidence. I followed it." He stepped closer, voice dropping. "You're making a mistake. The medical records are real enough for anyone who matters. You push this, and I'll make sure every therapist, every employer, every person you ever meet sees the version where you're unstable. You want that." The threat landed exactly where he meant it to. For a second, the old fear flickered, the one he had planted years ago, that I was too emotional, too soft, too much like my mother. Then I remembered the emails, the altered dates, the signature that was his. "I already have the version where you lied on official documents to steal from your own daughter," I said. "And I'm not the one who needs to be afraid of what gets made public." He stared at me for a long moment, then smiled that thin, joyless smile. "You always did think you were smarter than you are. This ends when I say it ends. Stay out of it, or I'll end it for you." He turned and walked back to his car. I stood in the doorway until he drove away, then closed the door and locked it. My hands were steady. My chest hurt like something had cracked. That night, I added the conversation to the notebook. Under threats, father confirms intent to use fabricated records as weapon. Escalation confirmed. The next escalation came from an unexpected place. Ethan called again, this time at midnight. "Olivia, someone sent me more emails. Not from Dad's account, from Linda's. They're talking about someone named Daniel Harper again, and there's a birth certificate attached. I don't know what to do with this." He forwarded everything. I opened the files on my laptop. The birth certificate was for Daniel Harper, born 28 years ago in another state. Mother's name listed as Linda Harper, my stepmother's maiden name. Father's name left blank. The next email in the chain was from Linda to my father, dated 3 months ago. "Daniel is ready. Once the estate is restructured, we bring him in quietly. Olivia won't have any claim once he's established as the rightful heir. The medical records take care of her. The rest is just paperwork." I sat in the dark living room staring at the screen until the words stopped moving. My stepmother had a son she had never mentioned. My father had known. They had been building a path for this secret heir while systematically erasing mine. The leak had come from inside their circle. Someone had decided the emails needed to surface. I didn't know who yet. I only knew the ground had shifted again. I called Ryan at 6 the next morning. New priority. Find everything on Daniel Harper. Birth records, current location, any contact with my father or Linda in the last year. He called back by noon. "Daniel Harper lives 2 states over. He's been in low-level contact with Linda for about 18 months. No direct contact with your father that I can find yet. But there's a money transfer from one of your father's old accounts to a trust in Daniel's name 6 weeks ago. Small, but it's there." The picture was becoming clearer. They weren't just cutting me out. They were replacing me with someone who had never been part of the family I knew. The promised future had never existed because they had already written a different one. I met Laura again that afternoon. She read the new files and set them down carefully. "This changes the legal strategy," she said. "If they're positioning an undisclosed heir while actively falsifying records to block you, we have multiple angles. But Olivia, once this goes public, there's no putting the family back together. Are you ready for that?" I thought about the 5 lines my father had delivered in his study. I thought about the notebook full of his own words used against him. I thought about the version of me he had tried to create on paper, unstable, unfit, easy to erase. "I'm ready," I said, "but I'm not filing anything yet. I want one conversation first, on record. I want him to say it to my face with everything on tape. Then I decide what happens next. Laura nodded slowly. Then we set it up the right way. You control the location, the recording, the exit. No surprises on your end. I left her office with a plan forming. I would arrange the meeting under the pretense of one last conversation about the estate. I would have Ryan positioned nearby with backup audio. Laura would be on standby for immediate legal steps if needed. I would ask the questions that mattered and let my father's answers hang in the air where no one could pretend they hadn't been said. What I didn't know yet was that Daniel Harper would walk through the door before I finished asking them. I spent the next 3 days setting everything in place with the same precision my father had drilled into me since I was old enough to ask questions. Laura secured a small conference room at her office for what I told my father was a final attempt at clarity before any legal steps. Ryan positioned himself in the lobby with backup recording equipment running on a separate device. I carried my notebook and a phone with the voice memo app already open. Single-party consent was legal here. I intended to use every advantage he had ever taught me. The text I sent was short and neutral. One last conversation about the estate. Laura Bennett's office tomorrow at 2. If you want this resolved without court, be there. He replied 20 minutes later. Fine, but this is the last time I indulge you. My stepmother replied separately an hour later. We'll both be there. Try not to embarrass yourself again. I didn't answer either of them. When I walked into the conference room the next afternoon, they were already seated. My father at the head of the table, like he still ran every room he entered. Linda beside him, arms crossed, expression carved from the same cold stone as his. I took the seat across from them and set my phone on the table between us, screen up, recording light visible. My father's eyes flicked to it. You're recording this? Yes, I said. And before you threaten me again, remember that I learned from the best. He leaned back, that familiar sarcastic smile appearing. You always did like to play detective. Let's hear what you think you have. I opened the notebook to the first page I had written after the study conversation. 6 months ago, you and Linda started discussing how to remove me from any claim on the assets from the sale of your firm. You referenced altering medical records to show I was unstable. You called the future you had promised me a tool to keep me compliant. That's not me playing detective. That's you in your own words. Linda's mouth tightened. Those emails were private. They stopped being private the moment you used them to plan fraud, I said. And the medical records you had altered, I have the versions with your signatures. 3 different sets, each one more fabricated than the last. Dates that don't match any real treatment I ever received. Diagnoses that never existed until you needed them. My father's smile didn't waver, but something in his eyes sharpened. You have no idea what you're talking about. Those records protect the family from someone who has always been too emotional to handle real responsibility. You proved it by hiring investigators and lawyers. The second things didn't go your way. I kept my voice steady. You taught me that when someone lies about evidence, the lie is the evidence. You signed the alterations, you sent the emails, and now you're sitting here trying to gaslight me with the same lines you used on Mark's 30 years ago. Linda cut in, voice low and vicious. You were never going to get that money. Richard built everything. I stood beside him while you played at being independent. The only reason you were ever in the picture was because he felt guilty about your mother. That guilt is gone. Daniel is the one who deserves it. The name landed like a second recording device had just been switched on. I looked at her. Daniel Harper, your son from before you married my father. The one you never mentioned. The one you've been positioning as the rightful heir while you fabricated records to erase me. My father's hand tightened on the table edge. For the first time, the sarcasm slipped. How did you... The door opened before he finished the sentence. Daniel Harper walked in. 28 years old, same height as my father, same sharp jawline. He looked uncomfortable but not surprised. Linda stood immediately and went to him, like she had been waiting for this exact moment. "Daniel, this is Olivia," she said, voice suddenly softer. "She's been causing problems with the estate. We thought it was time you met." Daniel glanced at me, then at my father, then back at Linda. "You said this was going to be handled quietly." "It is," my father said, recovering fast. "Olivia was just leaving. I stayed seated." "No, I wasn't." "Daniel, did they tell you they altered medical records to block any claim I might have? Did they tell you the emails they sent, planning to cut me out completely?" Daniel looked at Linda. She didn't answer. My father didn't either. I slid one of the printed emails across the table toward him. "This one's from 6 weeks ago. It mentions moving money into a trust in your name. It also says the medical documentation will make sure I have no standing. They didn't bring you here to meet family. They brought you here to replace me." Daniel read the page. His face changed. Not dramatically, just enough that I knew the story they had sold him was cracking. My father stood. "This meeting is over. Olivia, if you release any of this, I will bury you in legal fees and character attacks until you wish you had taken the silence I offered." I stood too. "You already tried to bury me with fake medical records. It didn't work. The recordings from today go to Laura Bennett and to the authorities if I decide that's necessary. The emails, the altered records, the trust transfers, they're all documented. You taught me to build a case that holds up. I built one against you." Linda's voice was ice. "You're destroying what's left of this family over money that was never yours." I looked at her, then at my father, then at Daniel, who was still holding the printed email like it might bite him. "No," I said. "I'm walking away from a family that decided I was disposable the moment it became inconvenient. You can keep the money. You can keep the lies. I'm keeping the truth and my name." I picked up my phone, stopped the recording, and slipped it into my bag. I closed the notebook and tucked it under my arm. My father didn't move. Linda didn't speak. Daniel watched me like he was seeing the version of the story they had never told him. I walked to the door, paused, and looked back one last time. "Family gatherings are over," I said. "Don't call, don't text, don't send Daniel to soften anything. I'm done letting people who lied about my future decide whether I get to have one." I left the room. Ryan was waiting in the lobby. He didn't ask what happened. He just nodded once and walked out with me. 3 weeks later, the legal filings were in place. Civil complaint for fraud and undue influence. Criminal referral for the fabricated medical records. Laura handled everything with clean, quiet efficiency. Daniel Harper reached out once through a lawyer asking for clarification. I didn't answer. My brother Ethan sent one text, "I'm sorry. I should have seen it sooner." I replied once, "You chose your peace. I chose mine. We're even." My father never contacted me again. Neither did Linda. The first Sunday after the meeting, I woke up and didn't check my phone for family messages that weren't coming. I made coffee, opened the notebook one last time, and wrote the final entry. Case closed. Not because justice arrived, but because I stopped waiting for people who never intended to tell the truth. Self-respect doesn't require their permission. It only requires that I stop giving them the power to rewrite me. I closed the notebook, put it on the shelf beside the one my father had given me years ago, and didn't open it again. Some protections require becoming the person they tried to make you doubt. Some burdens are only lifted when you stop carrying the version of yourself they created to control you. I had spent years believing the future he promised was real. It wasn't. The moment I accepted that, the silence I had been afraid of became the peace I had been looking for. Thank you for listening to my story. If your own father ever looked you in the eye and told you the future he promised was a lie designed to keep you small, would you choose yourself over the family that tried to erase you